Building, documenting, and dogfooding APIs. If you don't know what dogfooding is, it's basically using your own API, but we'll get that into that a little bit more in depth. So first off, my name is Jason Waldrip. I'm the CTO at Brandfolder, and I am a polyglot developer by trade. So I know a handful of languages. We use a handful of languages at Brandfolder, and I hope that everyone on my team kind of feels the same way. So, in my experience, I've been developing professionally for about 8 years as a hobbyist since I was before high school and junior high, wrote my first program. So, I've kind of seen the world evolve. And more recently, especially, the world of development is changing. And obviously, I put development in here because I don't want to talk about global warming or politics, because obviously that's happening too. So 5 years ago, if we kind of rewind, it was a really exciting time. Things like Rails and Django, Rails and Cake were really popular MVC frameworks. And it really made everything easy. It provided everything out of the box. It gave you the ability to construct your business logic and data within models, and also put together a beautiful design within one single framework. Then about 2 years ago, we started seeing modern JavaScript frameworks arrive kind of within the space. These included Ember, Angular, React, and Meteor. Are you all familiar with what those are? Most of you? Okay. And today, we're kind of in this really weird world where everyone loves these new frameworks. They've kind of become stable. So everyone's trying to figure out, how does my old, antiquated MVC that was really cool 5 years ago fit into my brand new JavaScript framework that I want to use? I want to move to React, I want to move to Ember, whatever it may be. How do I make those two seamlessly work together? So if we kind of look at the various pieces, so the back end, or the MVC, owns the data, it owns the business logic, and it owns the security model. It kind of owned both back end and front end before, but now the JavaScript framework implements the user experience and design of the application. We have two separate pieces now of our app. So really, MVC includes functions that it no longer needs to provide. So we can kind of look at the various pieces here and decide, what do we need to pull out, or what is MVC providing that now is being done by our front-end JavaScript framework. If we break things down, I know there's a lot of people in here who are developers, there's designers, there's people from all different walks of life, so I'll kind of frame this in a way that for people who aren't familiar will understand what MVC is. So MVC stands for Model View Controller, and that's broken down into various pieces. So your model essentially owns the business logic and data of the application. This includes, how do I assign an object or a resource and make it talk to my database, in addition to, if I'm adding some abstraction on top of that, how am I manipulating that data and doing that business logic within my application. The view presents the data of some sort in some sort of format or user experience. So that could be a JSON document, an XML document, or a full-blown user experience with HTML, CSS, etc. The controller is the piece that really ties everything together. So it takes the inbound request coming in on the website or mobile app or whatever it may be, and says, okay, given this input, how do I take the data from the business logic side and tie it together to deliver it to the end user? What view do I choose? What model do I choose? Does this person have access rights, etc.? It's really owned by the controller. So as we look at the various components in the new world, the model still has a purpose. The business logic is still a part of our app. The view is not really required. That's going to be handled by our front-end JavaScript framework. And the controller maybe can be simplified. So in this new world, I think it exists. Your backend becomes a model and an API. And some people will argue that an API can be done by the controller, but I'm going to break that down even further and explain why that's not the case. So again, your model owns the business logic and data of the application, and now your API uses information from the request to present data in a standard response format. The reason I said API, and the reason why standard is bold, is because that's the only thing that makes this thing work. A lot of people, when we first started getting into this world, spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how am I going to design my API? What is the JSON response going to look like? What does the routing look like? And all these different aspects of the entire application. become very complex, and you get caught up in designing your API and not designing your application. And we're here to design applications. Well, some of us might be here to design APIs, but I think if you are delivering a product, the application is definitely more important. So just to frame this, JSON, XML, YAML, TOML, whatever, these are not standards. These are formats, these are views, these are ways to construct data. But really, a standard defines the entire life cycle of an API. So that's going to include your requests, your responses, your routing, your schema and structure, and anything else that your API is doing, authentication, etc. So what are some examples of some of these standardized APIs? So this rubs people the wrong way, but probably the oldest is SOAP, which no one wants to use these days. It's very, very complex. And it got bogged down by a lot of enterprise companies like Microsoft and IBM coming in and providing their own flavors of the standard. I wouldn't suggest anyone to implement a SOAP endpoint, but it is a good example. And then another one that's been built by a couple members of the Rails community has been JSON API. JSON API is great. It represents, these are the exact paths and how you define resources and relationships, and it's very RESTful. So it's a great example of how to implement a modern REST JSON API framework. And then one of the newer ones built by Facebook is GraphQL. Has anyone heard of GraphQL? Awesome. Good to know. So GraphQL kind of flips REST on its head. There's one endpoint, and really what you're providing is a query, very similar to how you would communicate with a SOAP endpoint. So now that we know that there are standards out there, we can focus on building our API, focusing on that business logic, and really constructing our application. But let's not forget to document and test our code, which we should all be doing anyway, I hope. But even more importantly, because we're building an API, don't forget to document and test your API. A lot of people who are building APIs don't document it at all, and then they expect other developers to read through their code and understand what's going on. But you're not really documenting the code, you're documenting the interface. So the interface is really the important piece. I said that already. Not the same thing. So if you're documenting and testing your code and application, you're doing that with RSpec, RDoc, Mocha, these other tools that are used to document and test your code. But really documenting and testing your API is providing documentation and tests on the interface of your API, which is not in Ruby, it's not in JavaScript, it's in whatever standard that you chose. Or if you decide to write your own API, that's the standard that it's in. So to document your API, Stripe's a great example. They probably have the most beautiful documentation of any company out there as far as APIs go. But it's in order to disseminate information to your teams, customers, partners on how to implement an API client. And in a lot of cases, you may roll a client out with this. So in Stripe's case, they have a Ruby client, they have a Python client, PHP, Java, Node, and Go. But if we're, I'll get to that in a second. So the other point here is to test your API. So testing your API is extremely important, not to just make sure that it's working, but as you're iterating on your API and you're changing fields, you need to make sure that contract stays the same. You've got customers implementing your APIs, you've got teams implementing your APIs, and if you're doing any type of changes that are not backwards compatible, you're going to end up making a lot of people upset, whether it be internal teams or external customers. So the reason people don't document and test their APIs is because it can be extremely time consuming. No developer wants to sit there and write like HTML documentation for their API. They want to go find some product manager to go do it for them and figure out how to do the API, understand the code that they wrote. And then of course testing is different. It's not writing your tests in Ruby, although you can write API tests in Ruby and Node and whatever. But that's not necessarily the right way to do it. If you decide to change your API and keep the interface the exact same, you're like, well, Ruby's just not scaling, so let's swap it out for Go, or let's swap it out for Elixir. Having external API tests is going to allow you to change that internal implementation while your interface is changing the same, or while your interface is staying the same, and that really allows you to have external tests that make sure that you're still sticking to that same contract. So there's an easier way to do documentation and testing. If you choose an API standard like JSON API, or actually like SOAP or like GraphQL, or a number of other standards out there, it really documents itself. So a good example of that is this is GraphQL. So this is running on Brandfolder's production servers. We just defined all the types, put some strings in there of what they do, but it wasn't hard for the developer to build this documentation, and now I can click into each one of these types and understand how the query language works. This is a self-documenting API framework. But at the very least, if you are building your own API, you're using a standard that doesn't support documentation out of the box, use an API documentation standard, and this will help you test all of your APIs. So some examples of that are Swagger, API Blueprint, and RAML. Those are probably the 3 most popular ones that have appeared over the last couple of years. All of these come with testing frameworks that allow you to simply give it the specification, and you don't have to write a single test. It just tests your API, and that's it. So a bonus to all of this is, of course, automated testing, as I just mentioned, but most of these frameworks do ship with that. So now that you've written and documented your API, it's time to use it. Well, the benefit here is that whether or not you're building a public or private API, it is important to use it, and you need to use it, because if you don't understand how your API is working, and how you would be using it or how your customers would be using it, or even if you're on separate teams, you're an API team and you're handing it over to a mobile team, if you're not understanding how to implement that API, you're not going to be able to support them, and you won't kind of feel their pain. So this practice is known as dogfooding, or eating your own dog food. It's really good dog food, I hope. So this should be fairly easy because we use API standards. There are a myriad of clients out there that already know how to speak to your API if you use one of those standards. So with GraphQL, you've got Relay, which is the Facebook official one, as well as a number of other frameworks that have come out, or clients that have come out that speak very well to GraphQL. And then you've got Swagger, has a number of different clients that can just read your Swagger doc and build you a client. JSON API, there's probably half a dozen or more different clients to connect to JSON API. And then SOAP, there's probably about 10,000 out there. Don't use any of them, again. Don't implement SOAP, just again, as an example. So, kind of want to go over some of the ways that we've done this at Brandfolder and show some examples. I did go through that presentation very quickly, as I always do. Thank you. A lot going on. So let's take a look at that GraphQL example first. I just want to show you how nice that documentation is. So here, GraphQL not only ships with the ability to document, but it also ships with a console that provides your documentation and a way to really play with the API. So we can hit the API, run this query, and then get back the result and see what we've gotten back. So here I've got the documentation. I can search the schema, so if I want to understand, what a Brandfolder does, I can see all the different things that match Brandfolder. See the various input types, anything and everything. And then I can also go back and just navigate, go through the query, understand, okay, well, I've put in slug over here, so what does a slug do? Understanding the slug interface, I can see that it takes a string for slug, and I can really navigate and see everything that's going on within this implementation. So, really good example of self-documenting. Now, what we've done, and we're in the process of changing this, but we went ahead and, so our API adheres to JSON API. Because it's something that wasn't providing its own documentation, we decided to roll our own, which ended up being a success and a failure at the same time. Because we didn't roll out a standard documentation framework like Swagger, it was really difficult to kind of build these pages and mock these requests and do everything else. So what you're looking at here is our homegrown solution, but it is JSON API. So we can scroll through, we can see all the various requests that we can make and responses, and to see how to navigate the Brandfolder API. We are moving this to Swagger, so we're going to be ditching this generated documentation, going to Swagger, allowing us to choose any number of tools like the Swagger built-in interface, Swagger UI, allows us to use tools like Apiary, and then there's a number of other tools that we can use and just import our Swagger doc and generate that API documentation. And I won't go over any SOAP examples. If you're not familiar with Swagger, there's some great information on the documentation on how you can implement the various fields and paths. It's very, very verbose. This will adapt to about any type of API that you can imagine building. So if you've got something that's crazy and you're not RESTful, you decide that you want to use delete actions for everything in your API for some reason, you can document it in that format. API Blueprint is another great one, which is spearheaded by Apiary. What's great about Apiary is their focus is really on design first. So if you are looking to design your API, if you go to Apiary, they've got a great console that allows you to really build out your documentation first. And then not only do they allow you to build out your documentation, but they provide mock endpoints for your APIs. So if you don't even want to start building your application, if you're a designer and you want to focus building the front end and you want to wait for the back-end engineers to do everything, you can put together a pretty easy documentation and mock API and Apiary to do what you need to do. There used to be some examples on the front page, but I would just encourage anyone to take a look at this. And then the latest one, which has gained a lot of enterprise backing, is RAML. So this is backed by companies like IBM and Cisco and VMware. Very, very similar to what Apiary has been doing, but again, more backing. And they've used a more standard format. So Apiary uses kind of like a markdown syntax to document, whereas RAML uses a very familiar YAML syntax to allow you to specify the various paths in the API. Oops. So I'm going to pause and see if anyone has any questions.
I saw that was loading on an external site. Is your code, it looked like it was running on HTTPS, but how does that, is that stuff public?
Are you talking about the Brandfolder code?
Yes.
This?
The Stripe API.
Oh, the Stripe API. So this is, yeah, so a lot of Stripe's API documentation is all public.
Maybe it was Brandfolder.
Was Brandfolder?
Like, yeah. It was automatically generated.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is all public. So our API is public. We give everyone in the world 50 calls per hour to mess around with their API and play with it. And then we charge an enterprise license for anything above and beyond that.
Because I have things that need to be private and
sure.
Cannot be public. So is that a possibility for this?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, you can put any type of, this is just a rack app, but it's just a regular web framework. So if you wanted to put together, any type of authentication on top of it, you could. So you want your documentation to be private as well as your API. Yeah, absolutely. The other great thing too is if you're doing Swagger, what you'll get from your API is just a JSON document. And there's a number of tools. There's one for the desktop on Mac called Paw. That's great. There's a number of other desktop tools that allow you just to import the spec. And then you can see all the documentation, not even on a web page, but just locally within wherever that client is. So another way to do that too is if you have someone pulling down your app, just have like a rate task that generates the documentation or some type of command line tool that allows them to see it in the local version of the browser rather than going to a public web page.
So you're saying that for APIs that you build that are private, that you just consume on your own, Dogfooding, whatever, you still have to be using a tool like this, even though it's not public facing?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so you have customers no matter what. So whether it be external facing customers or teams that you're working with internally, or if you win the lottery and disappear the next day, who's going to be able to understand your code and your documentation? So it's important to document no matter who the consumer is, whether it be an internal or external customer.
I noticed you're using Swagger with Apiary. I didn't know they had added that. It's actually really cool.
Just launched it 2 weeks ago.
Okay. And do you like Swagger's documentation better than API Blueprint that they were on before that?
I like them both. It just seems like there's more community tools out there for Swagger. It's been around a little bit longer. It's more things support the spec. I think they're very similar. Swaggers can be painful to write, but Swagger 2.0 is a lot easier than Swagger 1.0. Any other questions from you?
On the point of it being difficult, painful to write, I'll have like a 10-line file, and when I add Swagger blocks, now it's like 110-line file. Do you have a recommendation of something better than Swagger blocks and Swagger rails for doing Swagger?
Yeah, so the route that we went, and what you're looking at right here, we actually wrote our own DSL to adhere to JSON API, and it generates the documentation, and the markup is pretty easy. So the actual definition or the controller, if you will, allows you. I can actually show you. I'll just do that. But yeah, I agree. It's painful also to write Swagger docs. It makes a lot of extra craft. So here's our, let me bump that up. Can everyone see that? Good? Okay. So here's an example of what we've built on our API. So we've got the ability to provide some documentation. So this goes into the Swagger doc, the description of the actual resource. It behaves like a class. We're able to include external modules into it. We've got parameters that the API supports on this resource, what attribute that we're going to look up in the API, how to look up collections and instances. And then really what it comes down to is here are all the various attributes that this resource supports. And we've specified the type and we've specified the actual description for each one of those attributes. And this again plays into the documentation. And this is still something that's being evolved internally, and it is public on our GitHub. If you guys want to take a look at it, it's called JSON APIify if you're Ruby developers and have a Rails API. But again, specifies how to talk about various relationships and anything and everything else. But I mean, you can also do something very similar in controllers. If you're generating certain actions, you know what your routes are going to be. There should be a way that you can programmatically define that documentation if you're using a similar pattern everywhere.
Do you feel like GraphQL is mature enough to be used in production? Because it's pretty pain in the ass with mutations and all that.
Once you understand it, I don't think it's that difficult. Facebook will tell you yes, they're obviously using it in production. It is a different paradigm. I think it's the difficulty in whether or not it's able to be used in production is not a question. I think is this something that you can train your developers to understand and learn? But yeah, I mean the implementation of GraphQL, the query language itself. I mean, it's not REST. It's very, very different. And then even mutations. When we first started doing read-only, once we got into mutations, it got a little bit more crazy. But now that we're used to it, it's not that hard to construct those things. And the console helps a ton to really learning and understanding those things.
And then, are you pointing the GraphQL backend at a database directly, or are you pointing it at an API?
So our GraphQL backend is a client for that JSON API. So we actually wrote a translation layer that interfaces directly with our existing API, which makes Ruby faster for some reason. Because Node is able to spawn off multiple requests to a number of different backend servers. So the net benefit is that we're not blocking in a Ruby app, and we're having much faster results coming in from the Node app.
I'm just curious where the term dogfooding came from.
Great question. I've heard it around for probably 5 years. When companies started releasing public APIs, the term "eating your own dog food" was said in a lot of instances, but then it just turned into like dog fooding is the word.
So there was a guy who had a dog food company that he claimed that his dog food was so good that he could eat it. And so I think that's the origin of the term.
Gotcha. How long ago was that?
Like, I think it was like in the 60s or something.
Okay. It's stuck.
How does Valcor compare with something like GraphQL or?
I'm not familiar. Can you?
It's Netflix. It's their.
Oh yeah, yeah, I have heard of it. I haven't had the chance to play with it, but it's single query, right? It's query-based language. It's not Rust, so pretty similar, I believe. The idea of taking, Rust makes you make a lot of HTTP requests, where things like Falcor and GraphQL limit you to one or two API requests or one or two HTTP requests. So I think they're both solving the same thing, just Facebook and two big companies.
So if GraphQL uses a good translation layer to JSON API in your case, when you're doing things like big aggregations, does your JSON API handle that pretty well, or you want doing aggregations with a bunch of individual queries?
Yeah, so I mean, if we spin off, if we actually make a query to our API, and I can show it to you live, we've got pretty good logging. So let me. Bump that up again for you guys. So if we make this query right here, and we look at the back-end calls, you see that the actual node server is spinning off probably about 20 different connections, but that onus is on the back-end server and not on the client. So we're able to leverage the amount of connections and the performance that we have on the back end. We also have caching layers that are internal to the GraphQL middleware. So we are spinning off, as you can see here, a ton of extra queries to our API. The good news is one of the other benefits that we get from both GraphQL and JSON API is JSON API as a standard supports the idea of sparse field sets, which means specify the fields that you need and we'll only give you what we need, which the same thing on GraphQL. I'm obviously only saying here that I need name, tagline from these various resources. So we're able to do that translation, navigate the GraphQL AST, and convert that into a query that to JSON API, which gives us other performance benefits.
What's your iTerm theme? Is the tabs on the left are cool?
iTerm 2 3.0 gave you the ability to put the tabs on the side. It's just a setting. I like it a lot better, especially because I usually have 50 tabs open.
I was like, how's he running his terminal in Atom or Sublime? Oh,
How do you handle pagination of your APIs?
Great question. So originally it was just next page and then just page numbers, but GraphQL had the idea of a cursor where you could do a select pass and select before. So we implemented actually a cursor adapter for Postgres as well as Elasticsearch. So you can do a select before and select after that's compatible with GraphQL. So
Is that just source?
yeah.
It is.
The Postgres one is, the Elasticsearch one is not. But yeah, that's actually in the JSON API, JSON API gem, if you want to take a look at it. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. So one last shameless plug. Brandfolder's hiring. We're looking for talented, smart people, anywhere from junior to senior. If you're interested in working on really cool technology and a great product with a great team, feel free to visit that link and apply away. That's it.